Hello, it's Friday, July 19th, and welcome to World Review, the Chicago Council's weekly look at news from around the world. Evo is off, and I'm Carla Anee Robbins, co-host of the Council on Foreign Relations, the World Next Week podcast, and I'm a former reporter and editor for the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. What a week, and it's still going to be an incredible week with reports that President Biden is seriously weighing whether to get out of the race. I'd also like to note that our colleague, Evan Gershkovich of the Wall Street Journal, who has been held for nearly 16 months in Russia on completely false charges of espionage, has just been wrongfully convicted in a secret trial and sentenced to 16 years in prison. Free Evan now. So today we're going to discuss what former President Donald Trump's choice of Ohio Senator J.D. Vance as his running mate says about his worldview and a possible second Trump term. Is this the final exorcism of Republican internationalism? We're also going to look at how Europe is preparing for the possibility of Trump redux. While Republicans were meeting in Milwaukee and declaring the war in Ukraine none of our business, the UK's new prime minister was hosting 45 European leaders at Blenheim Palace and vowing to, quote, face down aggression on this continent together because the threat from Russia reaches right across Europe. And the state of the Gaza war in U.S.-Israeli relations as Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu gets ready to travel to Washington for what could be a very tense meeting with President Biden, assuming his COVID goes away, and an address to a joint session of Congress, which is organized by Republican leaders who made no secret of their desire to use the visit to, quote, jam the Democrats. Here with us to discuss all of these issues from Washington, D.C., Yasmeen Abutaleb, White House reporter for the Washington Post. Yasmeen, so great to see you again. And double teaming us today also from the Washington Post and Michael Bernbaum, national security reporter for the Post.
Hi there.
And from Berlin, my longtime friend and colleague, Steven Erlanger, who's the chief diplomatic correspondent in Europe for the New York Times. Hey, Steve.
Hi, Carla.
So thank you all for doing this. So, Michael, is this your first time on?
This is my first time on, so I'm excited to be here. Thanks so much for having me. I hope it's not the last, but we'll see. You'll judge me.
You were up late last night blogging, I gather, the Trump address.
Yeah, I volunteered to cover the foreign affairs bits of Trump's nomination acceptance speech, which ended up going 90 minutes. Into past midnight DC time. And it actually ended up being a little tamer on foreign policy than some of his other big, his debate and sort of other set pieces. So, I mean, there was plenty of red meat in there, but he didn't yell at Europeans for not spending enough on defense.
But he did mention the late, great Hannibal Lecter, one of my particularly favorite Trump mentions, except Hannibal Lecter wasn't actually a real person, was he? So how could he be late? Right, a conversation for another day. So presidents choose running mates for a host of reasons: ideological, geographic balance, personal comfort level. And with J.D. Vance, he seems to be doubling down on what he already has, or as the headline on the story you wrote this week, he got a like-minded isolationist. So why do you think he chose Vance? And is this really the final exorcism of Reagan internationalism?
That's a great question. I think that he probably wasn't picking Vance based on Vance's foreign policy sort of philosophy or outlook. But at the same time, he does seem to have been attracted to Vance because Vance has molded himself. Vance has evolved over time, but he has molded himself most recently as someone kind of espousing a very Trumpian worldview, both domestic policy and foreign policy. And the Europeans I talked to, foreign diplomats I talked to about the Vance pick had sort of hoped that initially they had hoped that someone else could be the person. Marco Rubio they felt was a little more tied to traditional Republican foreign policy outlook. Others in the swirl, they look at Vance as someone who will really entrench Trump's more isolationist take. So, I mean, it does feel like a moment. There have been, I think, hopes among some policymakers abroad. I would say false hope, but hopes nevertheless, that Trump is kind of a blip in American foreign policy, and they're seeing Vance as someone who can really carry on the Trumpian view of the world even beyond a Trump term. And so Vance is very isolationist. I mean, he has a very different view of America's role in the world. Trump's foreign policy has actually been kind of contradictory sometimes. I think Vance embodies one strain of it, which is very much questioning why the United States is funding foreign governments, helping them with military aid, doing many things that involve sending money or help beyond America's borders. He's very much concentrated on bringing that money back to the U.S. and changing the American role in the world.
So, Steve, how did the Vance choice play in Europe? I mean, the Brits were trying their best to keep a stiff upper lip, but they were clearly not amused by Vance's recent remark that the UK under Labour could be the first truly Islamist country with a nuclear weapon.
No, that was extraordinary. He seems to have forgotten about Pakistan, but never mind. No, it's, people have been buying into Trump winning now for months in Europe, I have to say. I mean, there's been very little optimism that Biden was going to pull it off after the debate. The only question is, will he still be the candidate or not? The trends were heading Republican way, Trump's way. I mean, Vance, it's one of these things because he is, I don't use the word isolationist for Trump. To me, he's a transactionalist. He's very much involved in the world. He cares about international business. He cares about China. He cares about North Korea. He's very angry about Iran.
Miss Universe.
Cares about Miss Universe. And he has his obsessions, which have been unchanged for 50 years, that our allies are screwing us and they're living off our wealth and they don't do enough. But he was kind of pacified when he was president by a serious increase in European spending on defense. That has gotten even better. Everyone's perfectly happy to let him take credit for it if that's what he wants. I mean, I remember Lindsey Graham once saying to me, the way to Trump's heart is to say it's all about Trump, You'll be a hero to the world, Mr. Trump, if, this is just what you need to do to have a legacy, President Trump, if. So I think he's unpredictable. Vance, however, he's only 39. He doesn't really know the world very well, let's be honest. He's smart, he's articulate, but a lot of Europeans I've talked to have said it's odd that Trump would double down on MAGA. He's not reaching out to any sort of center. He's not reaching out to women. I mean, Vance is even more strict on abortion than Trump is. Trump actually was never anti-abortion until he became running for president in New York. He was not anti-abortion. He's just very flexible. Vance doesn't seem to be very flexible, except he's had a conversion. He's converted not only to a more traditional Catholicism, but to Trump. So he seems to me actually a person who's not comfortable with himself. He's come from a certain kind of background that he won a lot of plaudits for trying to interpret. But he blamed a lot of the problems in America on the habits of Americans. Now, of course, he blames it all on Biden. So it's all very different. So people want to wait and see. But, Vance has said we're not pulling out of NATO. He said that. I mean, I think Ukraine is the biggest concern. And you heard that at Blenheim Palace also. But a lot of people think the Republican Congress wasn't going to give much money to Ukraine again anyway. I mean, after this 8 months delay over the $61 billion, which really hurt Ukraine, it barely got through. And a lot of people in Europe felt this would be the last big American tranche of money for Ukraine. And the Europeans should step up. They know that. They're rich enough to do it. The question is, will they have to? And if they do, how much and how fast? So that's kind of, in early days, I'd say that's kind of where we are.
Yasmeen, how are the Democrats viewing this choice? You wrote that the Biden campaign officials had privately hoped that Trump would choose Vance because they thought he was vulnerable because he was so extreme. That was mainly about abortion and other domestic issues. Did his foreign policy views also play into that?
It did. You've seen the Biden campaign. Most of their social media activity has focused on Vance's comments about abortion. There was this leaked video a couple of years ago about where he implied people in violent marriages should think about staying for the sake of the kids. So that's a lot of what they focused on. But they have pulled up some old comments about his views on Ukraine, that the U.S. should not fund it. And I think what a lot of people see in Trump picking Vance is and Michael got to this, but ensuring that sort of the MAGA movement, the Trumpism, his view of the world lives on well after he leaves office, if he were to win again. Vance was sort of the leader in the Senate for this anti-Ukraine funding push, and you still had more old school Republicans like Mitch McConnell, who has been the biggest advocate among the Republicans in maintaining funding for Ukraine. But Mitch McConnell is going to step aside from being the Republican leader in the Senate. And then it's sort of wide open to see who could be the speaker next. And so with Vance, if you had Vance in the White House, I think what you would see is the Republican caucus on Capitol Hill, the sort of old school hawkish Republicans who are very much in favor of foreign intervention, would really not be an influential part of the party anymore. They would not have a voice. They would not have a line to the White House. No one would be listening to them there. When you had Mike Pence in the White House, he at least was receptive to that. He, still shared some of that worldview with people like Mitch McConnell, but you wouldn't have that at all in this White House. And so I think that is on the foreign policy side, that is the big fear with Vance. And so I think, President Biden has a number of problems right now. So foreign policy is not going to be at the top of the list in terms of how they're attacking Vance. But I have seen a number of materials come up about his isolationist view of the world, what he said about Ukraine, because polls do still show a majority of Americans favor sending money to Ukraine.
Michael, it's not just an exorcism of Reagan internationalism. I mean, Vance, and Trump sort of gone back and forth on this. Vance is also, he's really an economic populist, isn't he? And I mean, he's not only embracing tariffs, he's pushing for raising the minimum wage. He's raised questions about, he sounds like Elizabeth Warren when it talks about corporate mergers. So that's going against another big part of, the traditional Republican, what we thought of the Republican as sort of Republican big business. Is that, a reason why he was chosen? And do you think that's going to have any influence on if Trump is reelected, where they're going to go? Or is that just J.D. Vance? And anyway, he's just the vice president if he wins.
Well, I was, listening to his RNC speech, and I'm not sure it was his sort of finest rhetorical moment, but it was interesting that a lot of the economic lines, I agree. I was thinking these could very easily be delivered by a kind of left-wing Democratic candidate, such as Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders. And I mean, it just perfect, like very much. I wouldn't have batted an eye if I read them on a page and were told that they were from one of those people in the Democratic Party. That is embodying one strain of MAGA, of Trumpianism. It is, again, a kind of more, it's a populist, economic populist strain, but it kind of also fits in with the isolationism. It's about very much, deeply skeptical of global trade in a way that I think, Trump is less skeptical. He's just he wants to other countries to run deficits. He wants the U.S. to have surpluses, and it seems, based on what how Vance has talked about it over the years, he's just skeptical that it's useful at all. Very focused on kind of rebuilding American industry, rebuilding manufacturing capacity that's been lost over the last 40 or 50 years. So I think that's probably part of the reason he was selected. He will appeal to frustrated former manufacturing workers in battleground states in the Midwest. Although the people that he appeals to would have probably been interested in Trump anyway. It's a little hard to imagine that he's going to swing people who were in the middle. But I do see elements of to the extent that he'll be involved in setting the agenda, not clear, but a kind of different sort of global trade agenda, one that's much, much more protectionist even than what Trump has advocated in the past.
Could I?
Sure.
Please, Yasmeen, go ahead.
I just wanted to jump in with a quick point, which is that I do think with Vance, and it's not just the Democrats who see him as extreme. A number of Republicans see him as extreme. There was reporting that Rupert Murdoch and Lindsey Graham made this desperate last-minute push for Trump not to make Vance his VP. So I just wanted to jump in to mention that a lot of his views are viewed as extreme, even among the Republican Party, which has moved very far to the right in the last 8 years.
You mean his economic views?
I think his economic views, even his foreign views. I mean, I think domestic views, I think across the board, he holds a number of views that I don't want to say are out of step, because this is sort of where the Republican Party is at now. But even prominent Trump supporters thought he was too far to the right.
Steve?
Yeah, I was just going to mention, and I'm not there, but it seems to me if Biden has been running on I'm the representative of the white working class and I'm blah, 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 a foreign policy for the middle class and the Midwest, Vance hits all those buttons. I mean, I think domestically, politically, it's clever in the sense that he's young. He seems to represent these people. He wants to bring money home. Let's waste it at home as opposed to waste it abroad, seems to be the Republican view. And I think that undermines the Biden argument, frankly.
And no one, of
We'll
course,
see.
no one, of course, could possibly ever explain that tariffs actually is not money coming from China, but this is like
Coming from us.
That would take maybe 20 seconds to explain that it will drive up inflation. But okay,
Let alone NATO doesn't actually send bills.
Right. They are not greens fees, as I like to explain.
That's right.
But, okay. So, Steve, talking about NATO, you covered the NATO summit in D.C. You were just complaining before we went on about the humidity in Washington. You covered the NATO summit, where there was a lot of talk about Trump-proofing the alliance. And now this week, the UK's new prime minister, does he go by Sir Keir? That seems very un-Labour. Keir Starmer hosted this meeting of the European political community, where he said Europe was committed to Ukraine and to President Zelensky, who was actually seated right next to him, and quoting Churchill. This was Zelensky was quoting Churchill, and Starmer said he was committed to Ukraine for as long as it takes. It's one thing to talk the talk, but can they walk the walk? And how prepared is Europe to go it alone in Ukraine if Trump is elected?
Well, it is a very good question. Britain, I must say, has been very forward-leaning in a very bipartisan way. I mean, Britain has pushed the West, pushed Biden, pushed Scholz to do more for Ukraine, to provide longer-range weapons, et cetera, from the beginning. And that was true under the Tories, and it was very much shared by Labour. So Keir, I don't think he likes Sir Keir very much. Because that's not very socialist, but I think he's sincere. And I think, Britain under Starmer is trying to find some way back, if not into Europe, then at least closer to Europe, more alongside Europe, He's trying to take the heat out of the relationship. The Europeans aren't that interested, frankly, but on security issues, they need Britain, right? I mean, they're two nuclear powers, Britain and France. Britain has a small army, but it likes to fight. It has its own defense capacity. And I think, even before, when Europeans watched the American Congress delay on 61 billion, people understood that they had to do more for Ukraine. Now, what we're trying all to do is get Ukraine through this year into next year, which is not easy. The money has started to flow again, and there are more weapons. But by the end of this year, the Europeans should be producing 2 million artillery shells a year, which is a big improvement. There's a serious debate in the second Ursula von der Leyen term. She's just been reelected as president of the Commission, which is the more powerful position, of trying again to push Euro bonds even for defense, which would make a lot of sense. There's been some progress in collective purchasing of arms. There's much more to do in terms of money, in terms of interoperability, in terms of efficiency. But Europe understands what's in front of it, and I don't think is going to let Ukraine drop. And certainly, even if Trump said, okay, that's the end of the money, Ukrainians aren't going to stop fighting, and other people are going to keep helping them. I mean, the war doesn't end because Trump decides not to write any more checks, right? So when he talks about, oh, I'll get it done in a day, I don't think he's going to get Ukrainian buy-in, even if he thinks he can, let alone. So the hope is that, by this time next year, Ukraine will have at least stopped the Russian advance to the point, and it is building defensive lines, which it didn't used to do, that Putin will somehow realize that he's gotten as much as he's going to get, and then would be willing to go into talks in a more serious way. Right now, he's not, obviously. He's waiting for Trump. He's waiting, it's like Bibi. Everybody's waiting for Trump. Trump may not happen, but even if it does happen, I don't think Ukraine stops fighting, and I don't think Europe stops helping them. And so I think that was the importance of the sort of Blenheim Palace meeting. The whole idea of the meeting started with Emmanuel Macron, who wanted a broader idea of Europe that would bring in not just Britain after Brexit, but places like Moldova, Ukraine, places that were kind of new borderlands that were still part of Europe, though not part of NATO or the EU. And it's been kind of a talking shop, but I think it is a good idea, particularly as Macron's own position is much, much weakened. People are looking for leadership, and particularly on security issues. So Mark Rutte coming into NATO is a good idea. And Keir Starmer supporting Zelensky is kind of a given, but also helpful. So I'm not that big a pessimist, I have to say. I should be, but for once I'm not.
It's that move to Berlin because everyone's so cheery, all those cheery Germans surrounding them.
Well, there's good beer.
So the administration put a lot of effort into the NATO summit. I have no idea who came up with this term Trump-proofing, but I couldn't talk to anybody who didn't. It's like the first Trump-proofing. It was actually a great term. I don't know who came up with it, but congratulations on them. That was the big deliverable of the summit from Washington. How much does Ukraine take up of the bandwidth of the White House, now that the summit is over with, and how much are they focused on preserving their legacy and really thinking about Trump-proofing the Ukraine policy?
Well, I think the NATO summit came at such a politically weird time for Biden. They obviously did put a lot of effort into it. And I think, given that this came on the heels of the debate and this big question of whether or not Biden would step aside, they saw it as this big opportunity for him to showcase his foreign leadership, his leadership on the world stage to try to do this sort of split screen with Trump, where Biden is out there leading the NATO summit, and Trump is doing whatever Trump is doing, rallies at Mar-a-Lago. And they made a point all week of saying, Biden did this at NATO today. Trump wasn't on the campaign trail today. But I think what ended up happening, and Michael and I reported on this throughout the week and in leading up to NATO, is that the summit ended up being consumed by these questions about Biden's future. Is he going to be the nominee? Because of this very real fear of Trump proofing the alliance. Foreign leaders are just like Steve was saying, resigned to the fact that if Biden stays on the ticket, he is probably going to lose, or they feel he is probably going to lose, and they're going to have another Trump term. And Michael and I talked to people after the debate who were all saying it just felt more imminent after his debate performance and the way the politics here were unfolding. And I spoke with people. I know Michael spoke with people. I mean, you could not get through a conversation where people did not ask questions about, so is Biden going to step aside? What do you think of Kamala Harris? Is she going to be the nominee? And I spoke with a number of people who said that dominated their discussions with foreign leaders. That was all they wanted to talk about. And I think because it's just so directly tied to this question of, do they need to prepare for a Trump term? Oh, and the fourth question that came up is, what do we need to do to prepare for a Trump term that's looking more and more likely? And then, of course, Biden had his big press conference at the end of the week that was supposed to be on the heels of the NATO summit, but was also for a domestic audience, for him to try to prove that he could continue with the campaign and could handle this kind of setting. So I think it just ended up making for a very strange week where domestic U.S. politics were tied into a big foreign summit. And in terms of how much bandwidth does Ukraine take from the White House right now, I think less than it did, of course, in the first year and a half, especially once they expended a lot of energy on getting the big $60 billion package through Congress. And we know in retrospect that there were a lot of quiet efforts to secure that. But I think since they've secured that package, the idea behind it was to get them through the 2024 campaign. We know there's still tensions within the administration that are mostly related to President Biden rather than the administration more broadly about allowing Ukraine to strike deeper into Russia. But it does not seem the president wants to budge on that at all. So I think in some ways it's on a little bit of autopilot in terms of they've had this work going on for more than 2 years now. And I don't get this sense, especially, with the number of events that have unfolded over the last several months, the Israel-Gaza war, and then, of course, the president's own political crisis right now, that it's taking up a huge amount of time if you're talking about the sort of inner circle of the president.
I mean, even if I might, even at the State Department, where they, their full-time job is foreign policy, it's been striking to me. I travel a fair amount with Secretary of State Antony Blinken, and the degree of bandwidth. I mean, they are laser focused on managing the Mideast and war in Gaza, Israel. Ukraine is not a particularly big preoccupation of the senior leadership there either. I mean, there are people, of course, lower down who deal with it day to day. But I agree with Yasmeen. This is a sort of autopilot situation at this point, while they manage other crises that they see as more prone to blowing up.
We're going to move on to Gaza in a minute, and not on autopilot. But I did want to ask you very quickly, Michael, a question that putting on your old Brussels hat for a second, which is Steve said he was optimistic about the European ability to go it alone if they needed to. How about you?
Well, I think that, and so, Carla, as you mentioned, I was the Brussels bureau chief at the Washington Post for 5 years, and before that, Moscow. So it was kind of seen on both sides. I think that the Europeans are committed to continuing to help Ukraine. There is a tremendous amount of concern in Europe also about their. They have money. They don't have industrial capacity to just manufacture the things that Ukraine needs: artillery shells, long-range missile launchers, all sorts of things. They have some of that. They've been trying to develop more of it since the full-scale invasion happened. The United States also does not have sufficient industrial capacity for Ukraine, but it has more than Europe. And together, Europe and the United States have been able to supply Ukraine more or less with what it needs. So I think that the concern that I've picked up in Europe, Steve, is their day-to-day, but it's maybe less about their willingness to continue helping Ukraine and more about their ability to send Ukraine the things that it needs in sufficient quantity. And so that is the biggest fear that I've heard in terms of, the United States taking a significantly different path. So I'm not sure I'm quite as optimistic as Steve about their ability to sustain Ukraine with the things that it needs to keep fighting at the rate it's been fighting.
I mean, part of the problem is air defense. Nobody has it, right? I mean, they've produced more Patriots. They still need more Patriots. I mean, nobody's making the stuff. So it's not just about money. Even the Americans don't really have it. What I just meant was simply they're not going to quit because Trump decides it's over, right? I mean, and the Ukrainians aren't going to quit. And even if they get less help, they're going to keep going. And if they're building defensive lines that work, it becomes a different kind of war. And then we can get into all kinds of debates about how it ends and so on. So I don't disagree with Michael. I'm just trying to be Mr. Smiley here.
Which of course is your name.
It's very unusual.
Right. So I will commend to everyone listening to this is that Steve wrote a very good piece on the Times, which I'm trying to read with my old eyes here. How can Europe reduce its military dependency on the United States? Which goes through, and it's not just for Ukraine, it's also for Europe's longer range, finally doing what Europe needs to do for Europe. And it does sort of break through all the things that Europe needs to start building for itself, including lift and air defense and a variety of things. So as a defense nerd, I commend that piece to everyone. So Yasmeen, let's talk about Gaza, which is what people in Washington are paying attention to, and everyone will be paying attention to next week when Bibi gets to Washington. And Gaza and how the White House is viewing this visit. The President Biden had been pushing a peace deal since late May, and while taking a lot of heat from all sides for his support for Israel, either for doing too much and then not for doing enough. How is the Biden team handicapping the chances for a deal? Do they see this visit as a chance for advancing negotiations or just one more political trap to maneuver through? Gallant, the defense minister, reportedly told the hostage families that this time, even the next few days before Bibi takes off, is a really critical time to move forward with the negotiations. And Bibi says it's a great time to batter Hamas even more. So what's the thinking here?
Well, I think most Democrats see this visit as all downside and no upside for the president and for the party more broadly. I mean, the president is mired in a whole separate political crisis over the future of his candidacy. And I think Netanyahu's visit underscores the other major political vulnerability he had well before the debate, because like you said, people on all sides are mad at him. There are a number of people who are mad he suspended a shipment of bombs a couple of months ago, and that there was a period of time in which he was critical of Israel, and particularly on humanitarian aid. But there is a significant wing of the Democratic Party that is very angry over his mostly unconditional support of Israel and the death toll in Gaza, that he hasn't spoken out forcefully enough about that, who were threatening to withhold their votes over that issue. And so we've all been sort of consumed with this whole other crisis over whether or not he's going to stay in the race. And this, I think, is sort of a very stark reminder of some of the political problems he was facing before this all erupted. I do not think there's real serious hope that Netanyahu's visit could open the door to finally reaching a ceasefire. Just because I think, neither side seems to really seriously want one. And it does seem like a lot of Netanyahu's cabinet wants the deal and really wants to bring the remaining hostages home. But he has been pretty obstinate in that and is viewed as a huge obstacle in actually getting to a deal, because he said he wants to reserve the right to go back into Gaza at any time. Like you said, he said this is a great time to destroy Hamas. So this is not indicative of someone who's really seriously trying to get to even a temporary ceasefire right now. now. And I think the U.S. has gotten indications that Hamas might be more open to a temporary ceasefire right now, rather than, holding out on this demand for a permanent one. And so I think this address poses a lot of problems for Biden. I'm not sure if they're going to meet in person still, because they were supposed to meet, I believe, on Monday, and I think the president would still be in his COVID isolation then. So I don't know if the meeting will get delayed. We haven't heard either way. If Netanyahu will stay longer and they will still sit down face to face. I've heard from Biden allies both sort of views. One saying, why would you give him a sit-down meeting after the way he's treated Biden, when he's very clearly holding out for Trump and has been sort of advocating for Trump, and others who say you can't snub a foreign leader when they come to visit the U.S. and not meeting with him would be worse than meeting with him. So I think that just illustrates that this is a no-win situation. There really is an upside for the president with Netanyahu coming. And I think the expectation is he'll go to Congress. He will, this is an invitation that came from the Republican Speaker, Mike Johnson. He will thank the U.S. for its support, but then he will repeat many of the same complaints he's been making in recent weeks, that the U.S. has slowed weapons shipments, that they're not doing enough, abandoning Israel in its time of need, that he is going to take, especially when Biden is so politically weak right now, that he will take this opportunity to sort of batter him even further.
Fun times ahead here. So, Steve, you were an old Israel hand.
Yes, older and older.
You may be older than I am by a few weeks. So what's your assessment state of play? If Biden feels like he's under siege these days, Bibi can't feel much better. Why is he coming? What's he looking for? Is he going to make actually a substantive pitch on policy, or is this all? I remember that the Obama people went completely nuts because they were in the same situation in 2015 when the House leadership invited him without even telling the White House, I think is what it was. And meanwhile, Gingrich was telling Bibi, you don't have to deal with Obama. He's out after one term. This was just, he was playing American politics, but he was also riding a lot higher in those days than he is now. So what do you think Bibi's looking for on this visit? And do you think he, that he's under real pressure to actually to move forward with the deal or not?
Well, I always thought, having covered both countries, it's a domestic policy issue in both countries. The U.S. is not a foreign policy issue in Israel, and Israel is not a foreign policy issue in America. We're just too embedded with each other, and the votes are so tied. My big question, I thought Yasmeen did a great summary, but will Bibi go to Mar-a-Lago? That's my big question. And sort of kiss the foot of Trump. Now, that would be pretty rude, but Bibi is often rude when he comes to America. He gets involved with American domestic politics because, as I say, I don't think they see it as a foreign policy issue. And of course, the Republicans at the convention went out of their way to support Israel and to criticize Biden. And, they're going for Jews who are very normally perhaps vote Democratic, who are very upset by what they consider to be the rise of anti-Semitism and the isolation of Israel and sort of quote unquote wokeness on college campuses, which will come back in the autumn. So, people always joke that American Jews voted against their economic interests and voted Democratic. I think this time there'll be more anxiety. So I think Bibi will play on that. And he'll be, respectful to the president. Biden has been quite supportive in ways that have harmed Biden. But Bibi is very cynical. And his argument in Israel now, he used to argue he's the one who could really deal with America. Now his argument is he's the one who can stand up to America. He's the one that can prevent a Palestinian state. He's the one that can block Jake Sullivan's dream of some sort of Arab coalition leading to a Palestinian state. So that's his domestic argument, because he's really dependent on these two far-right coalition partners who have 13 votes. He's got 64, but he needs those votes, and they are openly want to annex the West Bank and resettle Gaza and cut off money to the Palestinian Authority. And, Bibi has a lot of trouble going up against that. I think he should, because I think these people have nowhere to go. But he's been reluctant to do that. So, yeah, he's in trouble, but he's in less trouble than he was a few months ago, I think, because though 85% of Israelis want him gone, they also want Hamas defeated. So it's a very ambivalent feeling, I think, in Israel. And Bibi will play on domestic politics in what I'm sure will be an utterly shameless way.
Michael, what about the grand bargain? What about this idea of Saudi recognition and a Palestinian two-state solution and all of these things that we're going to, that was a big legacy idea. Jake Sullivan believed in it. Tony Blinken believed in it. If Gaza is taking up a lot of their thought, that also fit into their idea of the end game for Gaza. Have they given up on that idea completely as well?
Not at all. And Blinken has spent many months going back and forth to the Mideast, shuttling around Arab countries to kind of get Arab buy-in to their ideas and hear what those countries' visions are, leaders of those countries' visions are for a day after something, as you say, grand bargain that would involve Saudi recognition of Israel, U.S. defense aid for Saudi Arabia, and ultimately a path to a two-state solution. They've hung everything on, the U.S. has hung everything on a ceasefire in Gaza, and it's not clear whether there ever will be a ceasefire. I mean, maybe, but maybe not. I mean, it could kind of continue at a low-level conflict for quite some time. And even if there were a ceasefire, it's also not clear that the politics are right in Israel and with the Palestinian Authority and Palestinians for a two-state solution. Not clear at all. So they have made this into a kind of a legacy gamble. If they pull it off, it'd be pretty impressive, but it's really hard to see how the elements are in place for them to be successful. There's a lot working against them. And, if you catch them off guard, I think they acknowledge that, but they've been working very hard to put together a package.
Can I just say one very quick thing about this? I think Bibi would be perfectly interested in the first stage of the ceasefire deal because he would get live hostages that would help him politically at home. He's not interested in going to the second stage. And Hamas isn't stupid. Hamas understands that the second stage can be prolonged forever, which would mean Israeli troops out of the big cities, which they kind of are now. Frankly, most of the big fighting's over. But a possibility of keeping going into Gaza whenever Israel wants. And that's kind of, I suspect, what's going to happen. I don't think there's going to be like a day after so much. There's just going to be a continuation of this low-level conflict marked by horror from time to time and the effort to kill high-ranking Hamas people. And that's, the whole thing is so sad because when do you start reconstruction? Who's going to run? I mean, all this is left in the open.
So, Yasmeen, last word to you on this. Biden put a lot into pushing this peace deal. He may not meet with Bibi. They're so uncertain about whether he's going to be on the ticket or not. But Jake is very invested in this. They're now focused on Ukraine. And then, of course, you've got Iran. If I'm going to predict something, I think Bibi's going to talk a lot about Iran when he's out there, because I think he's got to worry about Lebanon and the border.
Mm-hmm.
Do they do they have any new ideas, any strategy there, or are they just so caught up with politics that they're just not thinking?
Everything I've heard from people in the administration, from people who are working on this, is that the Gaza policy has become sort of listless, in that they have been so fixated on the ceasefire. And I would just note, the president was talking about a potentially imminent deal back in January. I mean, they have been working on this for so many months. There have been all these fits and starts. He said in March he thought a deal could come together in a couple days. I think most people have lost hope. I think the way Michael laid it out is how a lot of people see it, that there may never be one, and there will just always be this low-level fighting, but no real ceasefire in place. But they don't have new ideas. I think they have internally sort of finally accepted the Saudi deal is not going to happen before the election. I've heard some people throw out the idea it could happen in a lame duck, but even that's not a very popular view. And I think getting the first step for any of this would have to be a ceasefire to even be able to discuss a Saudi deal and a pathway to a Palestinian state. And that's just not, that's looking more and more difficult day by day. I think there were people who felt Biden made a politically smart move when he gave the speech outlining the Israeli deal to try to box in Netanyahu. But even that didn't work. He did come under a lot of domestic pressure to accept that deal, and it still did not come together. And so I have not heard of any new ideas on Gaza. I think they're obviously very frustrated by how difficult it's been, how little progress they've made. But, they're even talking about it publicly less. They're not even applying the same sort of public pressure on the Israeli government that they were for several months. I think there is a little bit of resignation, that there's only so much they can do. And when you talk to them, they always stress that the U.S. has way less influence than people think it does.
Sigh. Well,
sorry to end on that note.
You all have great thoughts, and I really appreciate this. And that's it for this week's edition of World Review from the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. I want to thank Steven Erlanger of the New York Times, Michael Bernbaum, the newbie who did fabulously of the Washington Post, and Yasmeen Abutaleb of the Washington Post as well. Evo will be back next week. We hope to see you all here then. I want to make a pitch. I'm Carla Robbins of the Council on Foreign Relations and the World Next Week podcast. And stay safe and sane, everyone, in these times. Thank you so much, everyone. See you all soon.